I don't know if everybody here was here last time for part one, but part one, we looked at the art of portraiture from ancient times up into and through the Italian Renaissance, actually the European Renaissance. And tonight, what we're going to begin with is the self-portrait. It's possibly the most iconic portrait there is in art. If you think about it, the purpose of a portrait is to convey both the outer appearance of the sitter as well as their inner spirit. And the self-portrait allows the artist to convey both with hopefully a unique honesty and integrity. Because of course, he has such great knowledge of the sitter. One of the earliest surviving self-portraits from antiquity is that of Bach, the chief sculptor to the Egyptian pharaoh, Akhenaten. And what you see here in slide one is the Bach, the sculptor, and on the right, and his wife, who's on the left. This was sculpted around 1345 BC. Most of the self-portraits were very common and spoken about in the writings that have survived from antiquity. But unfortunately, very few of the actual portraits have survived, none of the paintings. Plutarch mentions that the ancient Greek sculptor Phidias had included a likeness of himself in a number of characters in the Battle of the Amazons on the Parthenon. And there are also classical references to painted self-portraits. Unfortunately, again, none have survived. Next slide. Now here we have two portraits, probably the earliest surviving painted portraits, by the Flanders artist Jan Vinek on the right, executed in 1433, known as the Man in the Red Turban. The piercing gaze looking directly at the viewer is typical of self-portraits. Sometimes an artist will include themselves in a painting, and it's what makes their portrait stand out from the others. Most self-portraits have an intensity that a normal portrait does not have, because of course, the person looking out the eyes is also the person painting the eyes. On the left side is the portrait of the German painter Albert Dürer, painted around 1500. Often called the Christ self-portrait because of its resemblance to many early representations of Christ. Art historians note the similarities with the conventions of religious painting and the manner in which the artist directly confronts the viewer and raises his hands to the middle of his chest as if in the act of blessing. The hubris of the composition reminds us of the element of vanity that is part and parcel of all portraiture. Next slide. Here we have examples of self-portraits from the Italian Renaissance. On the top left, we have a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, painted in or drawn with red ink or sepia ink. It is unfortunately disappearing over the years. It's gotten lighter and lighter, but it's the only known self-portrait of Leonardo. On the right, top right, is a self-portrait by Raphael. And on the bottom left is Botticelli, and the bottom right is Titian. The Botticelli self-portrait is included in a larger composition with many figures. Artists have been known from time to time to insert the image of themselves in other paintings. Slide 4. Here we have a detail from Michelangelo's great fresco from the Sistine Chapel, The Last Judgment. Saint Bartholomew is portrayed holding his flayed skin, which is how he was martyred. And the artist has put his own face on the flayed skin. It's the only known self-portrait by Michelangelo. There are a number of portraits of him by other artists, but this is the only time he painted himself. Next slide. In a similar vein, perhaps almost as an homage to Michelangelo, here Caravaggio has placed his own face on the severed head of John the Baptist. Next slide. This is the great fresco by Raphael called The School of Athens. Here he has included portraits of a number of his contemporaries. He has portrayed Aristotle, who is in the, I guess it's orangish, reddish orange turban on the left side of the center arch. And he's portrayed Michelangelo in the foreground, leaning on his fist, looking like he was not that happy. It's kind of brooding portrait of Michelangelo. And on the right, hidden in the crowd, and you can see in the slide, the circle, it shows Raphael peeking out of his painting. And next slide. And here's the last example. It's a family portrait done by Diego Velázquez of the royal family. And here he has included his own self-portrait in the painting. The next slide. No artist in history is more associated with the self-portrait than Rembrandt van Rijn. Throughout his life, he created over 40 paintings, 31 etchings, and 7 drawings. From the height of his success to his financial and throughout his financial and personal tragedies, Rembrandt's deeply personal feelings of himself has no parallel in art history. During Rembrandt's lifetime, he had a number of children die before him. In fact, all of his children died except one. And both of his companions, his first wife and his Heinrichs, and his second wife, Saskia, also both died. And he also went through bankruptcy. So here's a man who you can see in his portraits as he ages and as he suffers through the travails of his life. You can see it on his face and in his spirit. The next slide. Now, art in the 18th and 19th century was dominated by academic movement in France, often referred to as neoclassical. Here we have represented some self-portraits by the artists who best represent that genre. In the top left is a self-portrait of Jacques-Louis David, the father of the movement. Now, all of these are details from the actual portrait. The actual self-portraits, close-ups of the heads. The self-portrait by David was done while he was in prison. he was a supporter of the French Revolution. In fact, he voted for the execution of Louis XVI, and his wife divorced him because of it. He was a Jacobean, and later, when the French Revolution dissipated, he was arrested, and this portrait, self-portrait, was done while he was in prison. On the top right, we have a self-portrait of Jean-Léon Gérôme, possibly the foremost teacher from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Over 2,000 students passed through his studio, and he was perhaps one of the most influential teachers of this time period. On the bottom left is a self-portrait by William Adolphe Bouguereau. Bouguereau studied under Louis Sage, who himself was a student of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who is seen in the lower right of his own self-portrait. Ingres, David, and Gérôme were the principal influences over the neoclassical movement. The next slide. Now here we have, in breaking with the academic tradition, we have self-portraits of the Impressionists painted in their early years. The top left is Fantin Latour. The top right, Edgar Degas. The bottom left is Claude Monet. And of course, no one needs to know who the bottom right is. That is Vincent van Gogh, perhaps the best known impressionist, known for his self-portraits. Next slide. The influence of modern art had an impact on self-portraits as any other form of art. In the top left, we have the iconic Salvador Dali, known for his work in surrealism. On the top right, we have Frida Kahlo, and her self-portrait probably is the only other artist who could argue that you could say rivaled Rembrandt in the extent to which she used that medium. She was disabled and spent many years on her back in bed, painting in bed. So it was understandable that her only source for inspiration was a mirror. The bottom left is a self-portrait of Pablo Picasso. And the bottom right is Chuck Close. Chuck Close would often make extremely large paintings, the irony of his last name, because he would make extremely large portraits, but they would be he would take like Polaroids, and he would blow them up to 4 feet by 6 feet, or as incredibly large, but they were also very close-up images. The next slide. Lastly, we have self-portraits of a few of my favorite contemporary artists. Top left is the work of Catherine Stone, a Canadian artist working in British Columbia. The top right is my good friend Richard Whitney from New Hampshire. The bottom left is Jeremy Lipking from California. And bottom right is my own small contribution to the art form. Before I move on to the next section, I wanted to make sure if anybody had any questions. Silence.
So actually, I have a question about the picture of, or the portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. So you said it was wearing out, or fading. Is there something that they can do to stop that or improve upon it?
Yeah, they're trying, but apparently not succeeding very well. I guess it's getting lighter and lighter with each successive year. Leonardo was a great experimenter in mediums, and unfortunately, some of them didn't last very well because he was much more than just an artist. He was a scientist, and he had no problems experimenting with things. So that's one of the big problems with the Last Supper in Milan, because he tried to incorporate an Etruscan method, which is kind of a wax-based method of applying paint, and it's over the years has just fallen apart. They really restored it, but the self-portrait is, we're going to have it forever in digital form, but works on paper are very difficult to preserve.
Joe, I have a question.
Sure.
This is Donna, Ryan's aunt. What was the sepia made from in those days?
Usually earth.
Okay, all right.
Burnt sienna is a very common pigment, burnt umber, but they're all different. They're oil mixed in with powdered earth to create whatever color they have.
I know I buy mine from Michael's, but I don't think Michelangelo had a Michael's near him.
No, almost all of their pigments were ground from available natural sources, and generally they would be stones, sometimes gemstones like ultramarine would be ground to create blues, and but almost all of the pigments from back in those days were made from earth elements.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that Chuck Close became disabled in his later years. He used a wheelchair, and he would be sort of hoisted up in a crane to get to the top and middle parts of his portrait.
Yeah, I can imagine, because his paintings are huge.
I have a question, Joe.
Yeah.
What year did you, this is Tracy, produce your self-portrait?
Oh, I was trying to think about that today. I believe it's probably about, I was in my early 50s when I drew that.
Is it charcoal or what is it?
It's graphite.
Graphite.
So what year would that be around?
Oh, I would say, gotta tell me how old I am here. I would say, the 2008 or 9, something like that.
Quite nice.
I did do, if you go on my Facebook page, there's an oil painting I did when I was in my 20s.
Oh, I'd like to see that. Good.
That's on my Facebook page. So it's you have to scroll down to the very bottom because it's one of the.
Great.
I've never really, self-portraits, while I admire them greatly, I've never had a compulsion to paint them, because I guess I've always felt like painting things I felt like other people would want to see, and it's hard to imagine someone wants to see me but I haven't taken any selfies either. So
I bet you a lot of artists feel that way.
yeah, Rembrandt was unique. I mean, because it was almost, I almost think it was to some degree an element of therapy, that because he really did have a lot of bad things happen to him in his life,
Right.
and I think it was painting himself, looking at himself. I think there was a spiritual element to it for him.
For sure.
I mean, if you see his paintings don't look like works of vanity. They really look like insights into him as a person.
Right.
And of course, the other unique thing about a self-portrait is that as you look at it, you're looking at the artist looking back at you. I mean, it's quite unique. I mean, when you look at another portrait of another person, you're looking at how the artist sees that person. It's not quite the same thing. You're not really looking at that person looking at you in the same sense as you are with a self-portrait. And I think that's partially why at least the good ones have an intensity that a normal portrait wouldn't have. Our next section, I want to talk about the effect about religion and portraiture. Can we take the next slide? Now, religion portraiture has always been a big element in religion, and it really has served kind of two different kinds of purposes. In the top left, you have the oldest known image of Buddha. Now, Buddha, they don't even know what century he was born in. So, I mean, the idea that they would even know I'm sure that his image is a fabrication. It's not actually, I doubt he actually looked like how they have portrayed him. Because this particular sculpture was done, I believe it was in the 2nd century, and hundreds and hundreds of years after he had lived. And the same is true for paintings of Jesus and Mohammed and the Mary. To the right is Raphael's painting of the Christ child with Mary. I'm sure it was some nice Italian lady that posed for him, but it's intended as a portrait of Mary, but these are kind of icons. They're paintings that are spiritual in nature, and people look to in a kind of almost idolatry where they are praying to it or through it. There is actually a line in, I think it's in Exodus, about, it was really that one of the original, it was part of the original 10 Commandments, was thou shalt not make graven images, meaning that once a person had died, you weren't allowed to make a picture of them. But that, over the years, that commandment was kind of altered to, thank God, because there would be no portraiture, right? But in Islam, there is actually a more faithfulness to that notion, and you won't find a lot of pictures of people in Islamic temples. All of their decorations are flowers and birds, but you won't find people. It's very rare, and unlike very different from Christian churches, where you have lots of images of people and saints and so forth. In Islamic world, that is frowned upon, and it's not actually prohibited in the Quran not to make a picture of Muhammad, but you really don't find people doing that. The picture of Muhammad that I have in here at the bottom right is a picture from an illustration, like a manuscript. And the painting of Christ is also a very early, one of the earliest images of Christ. It's about 400 years after he would have died. So again, these are portraits, but they're really more kind of representations of something spiritual, representations of the person for whom the religion has formed, but they don't actually, that's not really what the person looked like, probably. And of course, all of the blue-eyed blonde versions of Jesus are obviously not are not representations, because Jesus was pretty much Jewish. All right, you want to look at the next slide? Now here we have 4 paintings. They're all portraits. They all depict a particular person, but they have a very different function. And they have a spiritual function. They're telling a story of some kind. The first painting on the top left is a painting by Lodovico Cardi, an Italian in the 16th century. And this is a painting of St. Francis of Assisi. And it's, unfortunately, I don't know how much you can see, it's dark, but you know, the little animals running around, it just, the whole story around St. Francis, again, is a story. I don't know how real it is, and then certainly I doubt seriously that St. Francis even looked like that, but that was an Italian's 16th century impression of what St. Francis might have looked like. And again, it's telling a story. It's he's in a contemplative pose, and he's outdoors with a landscape, and it tries to capture the essence of who St. Francis was. On the right is a painting by Peter Paul Rubens of Daniel in the lion's den. And again, it's a portrait of Daniel, but it's a depiction of a story. So it's really more of an illustration, perhaps, than a portrait. But again, it's a spiritual nature of him praying to God and God sparing him from the wrath of these hungry lions. On the bottom left is a painting by Jean Everett Millais of Joan of Arc. And again, another story of a saint, not really intended to be who, you know, what she looked like, but more a representation of who she was. On the bottom right is a painting by Salvador Dali of The Last Supper. My favorite painting of his. And that's in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. I highly recommend, if you're ever down there, to try and see the painting. It's quite beautiful. Next slide. Moving from religion to politics, here we have some images that were painted. Political portraits have a purpose, they have a function. Sometimes they are simply representations of power. Sometimes they are meant to inspire. Sometimes they are meant for propaganda purposes. On the top left is a painting by Botticelli of Giuliano de' Medici. To the right, on the top, is a painting by Hans Holbein of the King of England, King Henry VIII. And of course, on the bottom left, a rather fanciful version of Adolf Hitler, painted by Hubert Lanzinger. And again, clearly intended for propaganda purposes. In the bottom right, I included a portrait by Shepard Fairley. It was for a poster, actually. But again, it shows that a portrait can be used for inspiration in a political sense. Next slide. Now here we have 4 portraits, but again, similar to the portraits of St. Francis of Assisi, these portraits are telling a story. They're political in nature, and to some degree, there were propagandist elements to them. The top left is a portrait of Marat by David, and this painting was one of the inspiring images that was used for the French Revolution. Marat was assassinated as he laid in his bathtub, and it was thought that it was the king or the royals that had done the crime. So to the right of him is another painting by David. There's no wonder they threw the guy in prison. So, I mean, his paintings were used quite a bit for political purposes. And after being big in the French Revolution, he was thrown in jail, but when Napoleon came to power, he came back into favor again. And on the right, we have Napoleon crossing the Alps. A very powerful image, but again, used for political or propagandist purposes. On the bottom left, just so you know, we in America can do the same. Here we have Washington crossing the Delaware. This is a painting by Emmanuel Lutz, and it's, you know, he didn't stand up in the boat, I assure you. It was very fanciful, but it worked. I mean, it was, you know, it conveyed a very patriotic and heroic image of Washington. And of course, this was a key point during the American Revolution. And it was what really turned the tide of the war to the America's favor. And on the right, the bottom right, is a painting of John Brown by Thomas Hovenden. And the painting portrays Brown right before his execution. And again, it's a portrait, but at the same time, it serves a purpose. It was a painting that was that would embrace the abolitionist movement. So before we move on, if anybody have questions about portraiture and politics and religion? All right, the next slide. I'm picking up where I left off on the history of portraiture, moving on to the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. This is, or the 18th and 19th centuries. On the top left, again, a portrait by Jacques-Louis David of the Emperor Napoleon in his study. This is another one you can see at the National Gallery of Art. In fact, the top two paintings in this slide are both at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And the painting of David is an incredible piece to see, because there was no detail that wasn't taken to a very high degree of finish by David. And the painting to the right is another great painter, the great portrait artist, of the 19th century was Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. You can see the influence of the neoclassical influence in terms of in the pose and in the way the detail, the manner in which the painting is handled. On the bottom left is a portrait by Thomas Gainsborough. Probably his most famous portrait, often referred to as the Blue Boy. And on the bottom right, another great painter of the day was Francisco Goya. Next slide. Now, all of these paintings were done by Americans, but with the decided influence of France, because all of the painters studied at the same place, at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And 3 of the painters all studied with the same man, Jean-Léon Gérôme. On the top left, we have a portrait by Thomas Eakins from Philadelphia. Now, Thomas Eakins, after finishing high school, right around just after the end of the Civil War, he traveled to Paris and began his studies at the École des Beaux-Arts with Jean-Léon Gérôme. Now, Eakins was, just to give you a sense of the man, there's a wonderful book if you're interested. It's called The Paris Letters of Thomas Eakins, and he writes back to his family, mostly to his sister, about his experiences and what's been going on in his trip across, what it was like on the boat and the ship, and weeks that it took to get there. And then once he arrived in Paris, it wasn't easy. He had to convince them to allow this American to be, there weren't very many Americans allowed into the École des Beaux-Arts. But he succeeded. The amazing thing, though, I found that with a high school education, he could write and speak in 4 languages. And he would write letters to his sister in Italian discussing Dante, which I found incredible. I never got that out of my high school education, but Eakins was a brilliant artist, and he was very early on as a student when the latter students that studied with Gérôme were studied much later. He was one of the early Americans to study there. The painting on the top right, is by William McGregor Paxton. Now, Paxton went over right around the beginning of the 20th century, and again studied with Jean-Léon Gérôme. When he returned from Paris after his studies there, he continued his studies with teachers in this country at the Cowles School in Boston. He lived in Newton, Mass. Very few people know who he is. If you look at my Facebook page, you'll find a section on Paxton about who he was and some of his paintings. He's an amazing painter. In 1910, he had a painting purchased by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which at the time it was a huge sum. And at the time he was considered probably the greatest American painter that ever lived. The reason no one knows about him is because of the century he was born in. Unfortunately, what followed was the modernist movement, and sadly, it relegated a lot of representational painters to museum basements and out of the favor of the powers that be, as they say. The bottom left is a painting by Mary Cassatt, also a student of Jerome's, a great American impressionist, and a very unique as a woman in this world, which was almost entirely dominated by men. She held her own and did very well. She was also from Philadelphia, like Eakins. And the bottom right, we have a portrait by the great John Singer Sargent. He was, this painting was called Madame X. At the time, it was considered very risque. By today's standard, it's pretty tame. But he was probably one of the greatest portraitists that America had ever produced. And the body of his work is phenomenal. He's well represented at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum because he was good friends with Isabella, and he was also probably gay, and not at a time where that was something that could be, known. But his work is phenomenal. His facility with the paintbrush, his ability to capture with just a few brush strokes, the texture, the light, brilliant painter. There's a wonderful fresco in Isabella Stewart Gardner called The Flamingo Dancer, which if you've never been, you should go see. Unfortunately, wheelchairs can't get very close to it because there's a few steps between, you might be able to get in with a manual chair, I don't know. But I have to kind of look at it from about 30 feet away. But it's an amazing painting. It's in a little alcove inside the museum. I think he painted it for where it is, I think she might have commissioned it.
Joe?
Yeah.
Is this the painting where originally one of her straps was down and he was told to correct that? Or am I thinking of another painting?
I don't know that story, but it doesn't surprise me because, even as it was, it created kind of a little bit of a furor in the art world for the time that it was painted, which seems kind of silly. I mean, obviously women were wearing dresses like that.
Mary Cassatt's great granddaughter, or I'm not sure how many greats there are there, but was Betsy Pillsbury, who worked at Spalding. She was
Wow.
part of the GBC actually for a long time.
Wow. Yeah, she was a great painter. And just like I said, it's very difficult to paint children. They don't exactly pose. I'm sure Heather knows that it would be hard to get her kid to sit still long enough to pose for a painting. And it's remarkable that her facility for capturing in all sorts of different poses and moods and time frames, different ages of children. It was quite phenomenal. Okay, I want to go to slide 19, the next one. And here we have the modernist movement in full swing. I've chosen two paintings from different time periods, but both in the 20th century and both almost around the same time, painted around the same time. The top left is a portrait of Grover Cleveland, President of the United States, by Anders Zorn. And to his right, the top right, is the portrait of Gertrude Stein by Pablo Picasso. And when she first received the painting by Pablo, she said, "But it doesn't look like me." And he said, "Well, someday you'll grow to look like the painting." I thought that was a little cheeky myself. The bottom left is Francis Bacon painting, and the bottom right is a painting by Pietro Annigoni of Queen Elizabeth II. And both were painted in the 1950s. Paintings on top were both done around 1906, and the paintings on bottom were painted in the 1950s. The next slide, I wanted to show some contemporary painters to you. These are artists that are alive today, currently painting. On the top left is a portrait by Jeremy Lipking, a brilliant painter from California, a great impressionist. Top right is a painting by an artist from Seattle. His name is David Gray. Bottom left is another piece by Catherine Stone, whose self-portrait we saw earlier. And she and her husband, who's also a painter, live in, they're Canadian, they live in British Columbia. And on the bottom right, it's my buddy Richard Whitney from Keene, New Hampshire. Now, Richard Whitney was a student of a man named Ives Gammell, who had studied with Paxton. And in fact, not only did he study with Gammell, who was a student of Paxton's, but he also worked for Paxton's wife. Paxton passed away, I believe, in I think 1942 or something like that. But his wife was much younger and lived on, and Richard, he had all sorts of stories to tell about Paxton because of his time working with his wife. But these four painters are, as you can see, just from their work, is that the art of portraiture the modernist movement has not killed it. Like, there are people that can still create incredible pieces of art. And lastly, as promised, on slide 21, this portrait I've been working on for about almost 2 years now. I've painted and repainted it so many times. This is Walt Whitman in Camden. I borrowed the title from the famous, there's a famous 9-volume set about Walt Whitman in Camden when in his older years. I was able to get the assistance of the curator for the Whitman Museum so that I could recreate the front room of his home. In some ways, it's a double portrait because at the top right, you see peering down scornfully a portrait of his father, Walt Whitman Sr. who did not approve of his son and who was actually very harsh and probably an alcoholic. But the portrait hung over his head in the corner, right in that front room. For many years, I used to think with Walt Whitman, thinking when I remember the first time I came across the portrait done by Thomas Eakins of Whitman, I used to think, wow, to be a fly on the wall in that room, you know. Here you had Thomas Eakins painting the portrait of Walt Whitman. You had this great poet and this great painter in the same room. You wonder what they're talking about. So I knew I couldn't be a fly on the wall, but I realized after a time I could paint the wall. I could recreate the room. So a lot of people would come and visit Walt Whitman in that front room of his little home in New Jersey. So I gave a little slice of winter coming through because it's the winter of his life, and a pen and paper ready. But I wanted to make it so that the viewer would feel like they were sitting with him in that front room, having that conversation that so many of his friends had. Mark Twain came through, Bram Stoker, Oscar Wilde. He was friends with Emerson and Thoreau. He was friends with Longfellow, and just there were so many people. There were artists and musicians and abolitionists. Sojourner Truth would visit with him, and so I thought, you know, it would be cool to try to recreate that. So that was what I had in mind anyway. It's almost done. I have a few touches to do, but it's enough to show.
Joe, was the mane behind his head part of the actual room, or?
That is actually a wolf pelt. And it was cold in those houses back then. No central heat. And it would, in the winter, you see the old photographs of him in his favorite chair in that front room. The back of his chair was always covered with the pelt from the wolf. So
It looks warm.
yeah, he was very poor. He did not have much. Mark Twain bought him a carriage so he could get around. He was paralyzed, believe it or not. When he in 1879, I believe, he became paralyzed because of a stroke, which is why I have the cane in his hand. It's just sort of as a symbol of that paralysis. It was just one side of his body that was paralyzed, but he had a wheelchair and he had essentially PCAs. He had people helping him get around. The most amazing thing about Whitman, though, in spite of, he had to have been in a lot of pain and discomfort, but just the people that knew him, the people that would meet with him, and in his poetry, he was such a bright spirit. He never criticized. If somebody criticized him, he would agree with them, just say, yeah, you're probably right, you know. And he would not, you know, almost the more I studied about him for this painting, the more I learned about him as a person. There was a great book called Cosmic Consciousness by a man named Richard Maurice Buck, who was a good friend of Whitman's. And it was, Buck had thought that different people throughout history had a higher level of consciousness than the rest of us, and were able to express it in different ways. And he wrote little biographies about each person that he thought had this higher level of consciousness, and you know, Jesus and Buddha and all these different people throughout history. And he thought Walt Whitman was one of these people. And I have to say, the more I read about him, the more I heard about how, you know, people reacted to him, how Whitman acted, you know. I felt like, you know, if Jesus could write, because he just loved everything. He used to say he could hear a blade of grass growing. You know, if he was walking down the street and there was somebody building a wall, like a mason doing some masonry work, he would just stop and sit and visit and find everything out he could about building that wall. And he just loved everything about life and everybody he met in life. And he was as pure a human being as I've ever encountered, and at least through his writings and through the writings of people who knew him.